Her stumble was not an accident. As her body pressed against his, the raw heat of his skin searing through the damp fabric of her dress, Sarah knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The washtub fell, forgotten, water splashing over their boots in the parched dust. His hand shot out, not to steady the tub, but to steady her, his fingers wrapping around her arm with a possessive strength that made her heart hammer against her ribs. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers and asked the question her soul had been screaming for months. Her husband was a good man, a kind man, but he was also a man who had given her an empty home, and this silent warrior was offering her a future for a price she was finally willing to pay. The oppressive midday sun bleached the dusty ground of the struggling homestead, a place where dreams came to die of thirst. For weeks, the Apache warrior, whose name she learned was Kyle, had appeared from the line of cottonwoods bordering their property. He never spoke, but his actions were a language she understood perfectly. He'd reinforced the sagging fence, cleared rocks from the stubborn field, and now helped her haul water. Each act was a silent accusation against the hollowing despair that had consumed her husband, John. Sarah's immediate thought was of John, inside their small sod house, and a pang of guilt, sharp and familiar, pierced her heart. But the feeling was weaker now, overshadowed by the electrifying awareness of Kyle's power, a power she so desperately needed. If this story has you on the edge of your seat already, hit that like button. We're just getting started, and this tale of forbidden desire is about to get a whole lot more dangerous. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with failure. John sat at their rough-hewn table, his shoulders slumped. He couldn't meet her eyes as he confessed he'd sold their last healthy bull. Not for coin, but for a promise of drought-resistant seed from a traveling merchant, a promise everyone knew was worthless. It was yet another act of impotent hope in the face of their barren reality. Sarah felt no anger, but only a profound, chilling clarity. John was trying to bring life to the dead soil, just as he had tried and failed to bring life to her. The farm was a mirror of her womb, empty and full of broken promises. But she now knew of another way. She realized that survival, true survival, sometimes required a courage that looked an awful lot like sin. What she was planning to do would save them all. Her decision solidified into a cold, hard resolve. The next day she began her own work. While John toiled in the field, she started leaving small gifts at the edge of the woods, a strip of salted jerky, a water skin filled with fresh well water. They were offerings, silent messages in a language of mutual need. The first complication arrived on the back of a tired horse in the form of Preacher Albright. He was a severe man, his face a roadmap of judgment. He sat in their home, sipping their precious water, speaking of God's will and the holy importance of children, his eyes lingering on Sarah's flat belly with a pious pity that felt like a physical blow. He represented the world that would condemn her, the law of a God who had seemingly abandoned her. His presence was a stark reminder that if she were to act, it must be in the deepest of shadows, in a world Albright and his God could never see. Sarah knew then that she was walking a path utterly alone, but it did not deter her. She began to learn Kyle's patterns, not like a woman in love, but like a general studying the field. She learned his signs, the subtle language of turned stones and broken twigs. She was no longer a desperate wife. She was a strategist, and her body was the territory she would either reclaim or lose forever. One night, a shadow fell across her window. Her heart leapt into her throat, but it was him. Kyle stood there, not menacing, but with an unnerving stillness. He held up a small, vibrant green shoot, its roots thick with fertile earth. He understood her barrenness wasn't a curse, it was a problem to be solved. He then pointed to the waxing moon, held up 3 fingers, and vanished back into the darkness. The message was clear. In 3 nights, the time would be right. A dangerous, unspoken promise now hung in the air, more real than any vow she had made at an altar. The following days were a torment of tension and secrecy. Her alliance with Kale was a fragile, unspoken thing, forged in shared glances and practical lessons. He would show her which desert plants held water, how to read the clouds for rain. In return, she would leave him a biscuit, and once a small mended cloth, her fingers tracing the careful stitches. Her Carnegie shell of a dutiful wife was a perfect cover, her quiet care for John a shield for the green payload of her secret strategy. The first true test of her nerve came when John, casting a weary eye toward the woods, pointed out fresh tracks near the creek bed. "Indian," he'd muttered, a thread of fear in his voice. Sarah's heart had seized, but she'd calmly replied that it was likely just a hunter passing through, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. Every day was a step on a wire over a canyon, and the bottom was a long way down. The true turning point, the moment that shifted everything, came on the second night. She met him by the creek, the sliver of moon barely enough to see by. He didn't speak, but handed her a small object carved from cottonwood. It was a crude but unmistakable shape, a woman, her belly swollen, holding a child. And Sarah understood. This wasn't a transaction for him. It wasn't a simple payment of seed for her gifts of food. It was something sacred. He wasn't just offering to father a child. He was honoring her deep, primal need to be a mother. In his world, a woman's ability to create life was a holy power, not a mark of her worth. In that 5-second moment, the last vestiges of guilt and sin were burned away. This wasn't a betrayal of her husband. This was an act of creation, a desperate, holy ritual to bring life into a world of dust and death. Her entire strategy changed. Before, she was focused on the logistics of secrecy. Now her purpose was to protect this fragile, sacred alliance and the new life she was certain it would bring. Their journey was a testament to a connection that transcended words and worlds. If you believe that the deepest understanding requires no language at all, comment, "I believe in true connection." But the world outside their silent understanding continued to press in. The next day, John returned from a trip to the small settlement, his face ashen. The whispers had grown louder. In his desperation, he'd confessed his shame to Preacher Albright, whose turn had called for the community to pray for John's cursed and barren wife. The pity was now public. John announced he was going to ride to a larger town to see a real doctor, a final hopeless pilgrimage. His departure would give her an opportunity, but it was one born of his complete humiliation. The stakes were now impossibly high. Failure wasn't just an empty cradle anymore. It was the total destruction of the man she still, in some complicated way, cared for. Her plan had to work. There would be no second chance. That night, Cale came. He didn't need to be told the time was now. He simply appeared at her door as the last light faded, his face set with the same grave purpose she felt in her own heart. He carried a small leather pouch. Herbs, she realized, not just for conception, but for strength, for life. He had thought of everything. The final confrontation was not with a man, but with fate itself. Sarah followed Cale through the moon-drenched landscape, away from the dead fields of her homestead, to a place she'd never seen. It was a hidden grotto, A small spring-fed pool surrounded by whispering reeds, a tiny oasis of impossible life in the arid land. This was his church. This was where life was sacred. The act itself was as silent and profound as their entire relationship had been. It wasn't the frantic coupling of lust, but a slow, deliberate, and spiritual ritual. It was the fulfillment of the title's promise, a transfer of life, of hope, of future, from a man who had it in abundance to a woman whose body yearned for it. She returned to the cabin before the first hint of dawn, a ghost carrying the most precious secret imaginable. When John left on his journey hours later, his face etched with worry, she watched him go not with the guilt of a sinner, but with the quiet, steely resolve of a savior. Her part was done. Now she had to wait.
The weeks that followed were the purest form of torture. Every morning she awoke with a sickening lurch of hope, and every evening she went to bed with the cold dread of fear. The pendulum of her emotions swung between ecstasy and despair with every passing hour. John returned from the city with no answers, only a deeper sadness that hollowed out his eyes. The town's pity had turned to shunning, their isolation now complete, but their solitude was a fortress for her secret. And then, one morning, it happened. A wave of sickness, a change so subtle no one else would notice, but she knew. A tiny flicker of life had taken root in the barren dust. It was a moment of earth-shattering triumph, so profound and so private that she could only weep in silence, her tears watering the fertile ground of her own body. Months later, her pregnancy was a swelling, undeniable miracle. To John, it was exactly that. He fell to his knees, his face pressed against her belly, and wept with a joy so pure it was heartbreaking. He thanked God. He thanked the doctor's useless advice. He never once suspected the truth. His wife's miracle had saved him. The spark of life in her had reignited the spark in him. He began to work the homestead with a renewed vigor, and for the first time, the land responded. As Sarah watched her husband repair the fence Kael had first mended, a complex and beautiful sadness settled in her heart. She had given him a lie, and that lie had given him back his life. She understood then that the world was not a place of simple truths, of good and evil, but a tangled web of desperate needs and impossible choices. She gave birth to a healthy, beautiful boy as the first winter snows began to fall. He had her fair hair, but his eyes were dark and deep, pools of ancient wisdom that held the silent gravity of his true father. John was incandescent with love, a man reborn, and Sarah found a peace she never thought possible. One day she knew she would have to tell her son the story of the two men who had given him the world, the gentle, loving father who would raise him, and the silent, powerful father who had given him life. For now she held him close. One crisp afternoon, as she stood at the edge of the property, she saw him. Kael, sitting on his horse on a distant ridge, a motionless silhouette against the vast blue sky. He was watching over them. He held her gaze for a long moment, a final silent acknowledgement, before turning his horse and melting back into the wilderness, his purpose fulfilled. Life always finds a way, pushing through the driest dust and the deepest sorrow. And perhaps the truest legacy a person can leave is not one of blood, but of the fierce and unrelenting courage to create hope where there is none. If this tale of forbidden love and second chances stirred something in your soul, show some love with a like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love hearing from fellow wanderers and dreamers, no matter which corner of the world you call home.